The Farewell Ambassador Park. GA stood at the center of the Grand Assembly Hall and looked at the faces of 100 alien species who had never wanted her there. The hall stretched upward like a cathedral made of light and crystal, and representatives from every corner of the galaxy filled the floating platforms that circled the speaking floor park. GA wore the simple gray uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps, and she carried a single datapad in her hands. She had rehearsed this speech 1,000 times. But now the words felt heavy on her tongue. Honored members of the Galactic Council, she began, her voice steady and calm. I come before you today to deliver a formal notice from the United Earth Government. Whispers rippled through the assembly, and she could see Councillor Vareth, tall son of the Velthari, lean forward with obvious interest. His silver scales caught the light, and his thin mouth curved into something that was almost a smile. Effective immediately, Park GA continued. Humanity withdraws from all treaties, agreements, and obligations with the Galactic Council, and we renounce our observer status in this body. The whispers became murmurs, and the murmurs became open conversation. She heard laughter from several platforms, and she did not flinch. Earth and all human colonies will close their borders to galactic traffic, and all human military assets will return to human space within 60 standard days. Councillor Vareth rose from his seat and spread his forearms wide in a gesture of theatrical surprise. Ambassador, he said, his translator giving his words a mocking tone. This is wonderful news. The Council thanks humanity for finally accepting its proper place. More laughter followed, and Park GA felt the old anger rise in her chest before she pushed it down again. She had expected this, and she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her react. High Arbiter Morvan, the ancient creature who led the Council, raised one of his many tentacles for silence. Ambassador Park, he said in his deep and rumbling voice, may we ask what has prompted this decision? Park GA looked at him and saw nothing but polite curiosity in his enormous eyes. He did not care. She realized, and he had never cared. You may ask, she said, but the answer would require you to listen. And listening has never been something this council does well when humans speak. The laughter stopped, and an uncomfortable silence filled the hall. For 200 years, humanity has served as a member of the galactic community, Park GA said, and her voice grew stronger with each word. And for 200 years, we have been treated as dangerous animals who somehow learned to build starships. She tapped her datapad, and a holographic display appeared above her head, showing document after document, 17 requests for colonization rights. All denied because humans breed too quickly and might spread too far. Another tap. Another set of documents, 43 applications for advanced technology sharing. All rejected because humans might use the technology for war. Councillor Vareth shifted in his seat, and his smile faded just a little. 112 votes to restrict human travel, human trade, and human representation, all passed by overwhelming majorities. Park GA lowered her datapad and looked around the assembly with eyes that held no anger, only exhaustion. We came to you with open hands, she said, and you slapped them away because you were afraid of what we might become. She paused and took a deep breath. You were so busy watching us for signs of violence that you never noticed what we were actually doing. High above the planet, Admiral Yoon Seo-jin watched the assembly through a secure feed on the bridge of his flagship. His face showed no emotion as he listened to Park GA speak the words they had written together. Over long and sleepless nights, Admiral, his first officer said quietly, all ships report ready for withdrawal, and Perimeter Command confirms the last rotation is complete. Yoon nodded slowly and felt the weight of 200 years pressing down on his shoulders. He had spent his entire career fighting a war that no one else knew existed, And now he was about to walk away and leave the galaxy to face the consequences. Begin withdrawal sequence, he ordered, and his voice was as steady as stone. All units are to maintain communication silence with non-human vessels. The bridge crew moved with quiet efficiency, and Yoon returned his attention to the assembly below. Park Ga was finishing her speech now, and he could hear the sadness in her voice, even through the transmission. "We protected you," she was saying, and every word carried the exhaustion of generations, and you never asked why. Because you never believed we were capable of anything but destruction. She bowed her head slightly in a gesture of farewell. "We are tired, counselors, and we are done." She turned and walked toward the exit, and not a single voice called out to stop her. Counselor Vareth began to clap his 4 hands together in slow and mocking applause, and others joined him until the sound filled the hall like thunder. Park Ga did not look back in orbit. Admiral Yoon watched the first human ships engage their jump drives and vanish into the darkness between stars, one by one. The vessels that had guarded silent borders for 2 centuries disappeared from Council space. The sectors they had patrolled grew quiet, and no one noticed the shadows that began to stir in the emptiness they left behind. High Arbiter Morvine watched the human ambassador leave and felt something strange in his ancient hearts. It was not relief, and it was not satisfaction. It was the first whisper of a fear he could not name, and he pushed it aside because surely the galaxy would be better without the violent and primitive humans. Surely they had nothing to worry about now. Last human ship jumped away, and the stars grew dark and cold in the spaces where they had stood watch for so long. No one celebrated in those empty sectors. No one was left to celebrate at all. The silence before 3 months passed, and the Galactic Council declared the human withdrawal a complete success rate. Routes that had once required human inspection now flowed freely, and merchant vessels moved without the delays that Earth's paranoid security measures had always caused. Councillor Vareth Talsan gave speeches about the new era of prosperity, and other representatives nodded along with eager agreement. The galaxy, they told themselves, had never been better. Observer Crix of the Thelian species did not share this optimism. She was small even by Thelian standards, with large nervous eyes and antennae that never stopped twitching, and she worked in the data analysis division of the Council Security Bureau. Her job was to watch the numbers and report anything unusual. And lately the numbers had been very unusual indeed. "Councillor Vareth," she said during a routine briefing, her voice high and trembling, "I have noticed some concerning patterns in the outer sectors." Vareth barely looked at her, and his silver scales rippled with impatience. "What patterns?" he asked in a tone that made it clear he did not actually want to know. "Communication blackouts," Crix said, and she pulled up a holographic map of the galactic rim. "In the past month, we have lost contact with 14 monitoring stations in Sector 77 Null and the surrounding regions." Vareth waved one of his 4 hands dismissively. "Equipment failures," he said. "Those stations are old, and humans were the ones who maintained them before they left." "But Counselor," Crix pressed on despite her fear, "these are the sectors that humans patrolled most heavily, and I found records in their declassified files that reference something called perimeter operations." She showed him the documents, and her antennae quivered with anxiety. "They spent enormous resources on these patrols, but there is no record of any enemy they were fighting." Vareth laughed, and the sound was cold and sharp. "Humans saw enemies everywhere because they are a violent species," he said. "They probably invented threats to justify their military spending, and now that they are gone, we can see there was never any danger at all," Crix wanted to argue. But she was small, and he was powerful, and she lowered her head and said nothing more. That night, she stayed late in her office and dug deeper into the human records. What she found made her blood run cold. The humans had not invented their enemy. And they had not been paranoid. They had been fighting something in the dark spaces between stars. Something that their reports called the Hollow. And they had been fighting it for 200 years. Critics read reports of battles that had cost thousands of human lives. Of weapons developed specifically to harm creatures that existed between dimensions. Of an endless war that humanity had waged in secret while the council mocked them for being primitive. Her hand shook as she copied the files to her personal datapad. She had to warn someone. But who would believe her? Far from the gleaming halls of the council, a frontier colony called Varath's Promise sat on the edge of known space. The colonists were Velthari settlers, and they had named their new home after the counselor who had championed their expansion into the territories that humans had abandoned. They did not notice. When the stars began to disappear first, it was just one or two distant pinpricks of light that winked out as if someone had blown out a candle. Then more followed, and the night sky grew darker than any of the colonists had ever seen. A young Velthari named Sethic stood on his family's farm and watched the darkness spread across the horizon. Mother, he called out with fear creeping into his voice. Something is wrong with the sky. His mother came outside and looked up, and her forearms wrapped around herself in a gesture of instinctive terror. The darkness was not empty. They realized something was moving in it. Something vast and hungry that swallowed the light itself. The colony's communication tower activated automatically and sent out a distress signal. This is Varath's Promise. Calling any available ships, the automated message said. We are experiencing an unknown phenomenon and request immediate assistance. The message repeated once, twice, 3 times, then the tower went silent. And the colony went dark. High Arbiter Morvan received the report of the lost colony the next morning. And for the first time since the humans had left, he felt true fear. How many colonists? He asked, and his voice was heavy with dread. 4,000. His aide replied. All gone without a trace. And our scout ships found nothing, not bodies, not ruins, not even debris. Morvan closed his many eyes and remembered Park Jihee's final words, we protected you. She had said, and you never asked why. He had thought she was being dramatic. And he had thought she was trying to frighten them into asking the humans to stay now. He wondered if she had been telling the simple truth. Send a message to Earth, he ordered, and his tentacles curled with anxiety. Ask them what they know about Sector 77 Null. The message was sent, and the hours passed in terrible silence when the response finally came. It was only 2 words. Message to Clinid. Morvan stared at the screen and felt the weight of every vote he had cast against humanity, every restriction he had supported. Every dismissive word he had spoken about the primitive apes who had somehow stumbled into space. They had asked for help once. He remembered now they had come to the council with reports of something terrible in the darkness. And the council had laughed them out of the chamber. Now the darkness was coming. And the humans were not there to hold it back. In her small office, Observer Crix finished reading the last of the human reports and understood at last why humanity had been so willing to leave. They had not been running away. They had been letting go of a burden they had carried alone for far too long. The galaxy had never deserved their protection, and now the galaxy would learn what that protection had cost. The Hollow arrives. Counselor Vareth Talsan stood on the bridge of the Velthari warship triumphant and watched his fleet emerged from hyperspace into the silent sector where 6 colonies had vanished. He had come personally to prove that there was nothing to fear, that the human warnings were lies, and that the great Velthari Navy could handle any threat. Scan the area, he commanded, and his voice carried the confidence of someone who had never truly faced danger. The sensors swept across empty space, and the crew waited in tense silence. Counselor, the sensor officer said with confusion in his voice, I am detecting unusual readings from the third planet, but I cannot identify what they are. Vareth moved closer to the display and frowned at the strange patterns. What do you mean you cannot identify them? He demanded. The readings do not match any known energy signature, the officer replied. It is as if something is there, but also not there, existing partially outside our dimension. A chill ran down Vareth's spine. But he pushed it aside. Move the fleet into orbit, he ordered. We will investigate directly. The Triumphant and its escort ships glided toward the silent planet. And every crew member felt the wrongness in the space around them. The stars seemed dimmer here, and shadows moved at the edges of their vision in ways that made no sense. Counselor, the communications officer said suddenly, I am receiving a transmission from the planet's surface. From survivors? Vareth asked with hope rising in his chest. No, sir, the officer replied. And her face had gone pale. It is in an unknown language, but our translators are attempting to decode it. Static filled the bridge. And then a voice emerged from the speakers. It was not a voice made by any throat or mouth, but a sound that seemed to crawl directly into their minds. Finally, the voice whispered, and every being on the bridge felt their blood turn to ice. The Guardians have left, and you are unprotected at last. Vareth stumbled backward, and his forearms reached for something to steady himself. What are you? He demanded, but his voice cracked with terror. We are what waits in the spaces between, the voice replied. We are hunger without end, and we have been patient for so very long. The darkness outside the viewport began to move, and Vareth saw them for the first time. The hollow were not creatures in any sense he understood, but shapes of absolute emptiness that drifted through space like holes in reality itself. They had no eyes, but he felt them looking at him. They had no mouths, but he knew they were hungry. All ships opened fire. Vareth screamed, and the fleet unleashed everything they had. Plasma bolts and missile barrages tore through space toward the approaching darkness. And Vareth watched with desperate hope as the weapons struck their targets. The hollow did not even slow down. The weapons passed through them as if they were made of smoke. And the darkness kept coming. Nothing is working. The weapons officer shouted, Our attacks have no effect at all. Vareth watched in horror as the first escort ship was engulfed by one of the hollow. And the vessel did not explode or break apart, it simply went dark. And every life sign aboard vanished in an instant. Screams filled the communication channels as ship after ship met the same fate. And Vareth understood at last why the humans had developed such strange and specific weapons. They had faced this enemy before, and they had found a way to fight it, but the humans were gone, and the Velthri had nothing. Retreat, Vareth ordered, and his voice was raw with panic. All ships retreat immediately. The Triumphant's engines roared to life, and the ship fled toward the hyperspace jump point with the survivors of the fleet close behind. Vareth looked back at the sensor display and saw the hollow following, moving through space with a speed that should have been impossible. They are gaining on us, the helm officer reported, and tears streamed down her face. We will not make it to the jump point. Vareth closed his eyes and thought of every dismissive word he had spoken about humans, every vote he had cast against them, every time he had laughed at their warnings. He had been so certain that they were the threat, and he had been so terribly wrong. Counselor, the sensor officer said with wonder in her voice. Something is happening behind us. Vareth opened his eyes and looked at the display, and what he saw made no sense. The hollow had stopped chasing, and they were pulling back toward the planet, as if something had frightened them. Then he understood. A single human ship had emerged from hyperspace between the fleet and the hollow. A small patrol vessel barely larger than a Fayer shuttle. It was broadcasting a signal that made the hollow recoil like predators facing fire. This is Captain Kang Do-yoon of the human vessel. Vigilant, a calm voice said over the communication channel. "I was conducting a routine sweep of the border when I detected your distress signals." Varath stared at the tiny ship that had stopped the darkness, and shame burned in his chest like acid. "Counselor?" Captain Kang continued. "I suggest you return to Council space immediately, and when you arrive, I suggest you tell them what you saw here today." The Vigilant held its position until the Velthari fleet jumped to safety, and only then did it disappear back into the darkness. Varath stood alone on his bridge, surrounded by the survivors of a fleet that had numbered 40 ships when they arrived. Only 7 remained. He had come to prove that humanity was wrong, and instead he had learned the terrible truth. The humans had not been violent or paranoid or primitive. They had been the only thing standing between the galaxy and annihilation. And the galaxy had thanked them with mockery and scorn now. The Hollow were awake, and the real nightmare was only beginning. The weight of pride, the Grand Assembly Hall that had once echoed with laughter at humanity's departure, now trembled with fear. Representatives from 100 species crowded the speaking platforms, and their voices rose in a chaos of accusations and desperate pleas. High Arbiter Morvan struggled to maintain order as the galaxy fell apart around him. 17 systems have gone dark in the past week. A delegate from the Crithian Collective shouted, "Our homeworld will be next if we do not act. The Hollow are moving toward the core." Another representative cried, "We must evacuate." "Evacuate to where?" Councillor Varath asked, and his voice was hollow and broken. "There is nowhere they cannot reach." He had not been the same since his return from the border, and the scales that had once shone with arrogant pride now hung dull and gray. Observer Crick stepped forward and raised her small hand for attention. "I have finished analyzing all available human records," she said, and her voice trembled but did not break. "And I now understand what they were doing for 200 years. The hall fell silent, and every eye turned toward the tiny Thelian analyst. "The humans discovered the Hollow 2 centuries ago during their first deep space explorations," Crix explained, and she projected holographic images above her head. "The creatures attacked a human colony ship and consumed everyone aboard." Gasps filled the chamber as images of the massacre played across the display. But humans did not flee or hide. Crix continued. "Instead, they studied the enemy. They developed weapons that could harm beings made of dimensional instability, and they built a perimeter of defense around the entire galaxy." She showed them maps of patrol routes that had covered every possible entry point from the dark spaces beyond known stars. "They fought and died in silence for generations, and they never told us because they knew we would not believe them." High Arbiter Morvan leaned forward, and his ancient voice was heavy with shame. "They told us once," he said, and every word seemed to cause him pain. "I remember now. 50 years ago, a human admiral came to this very chamber and warned us about something in the darkness. He closed his many eyes. We laughed at him and called him paranoid." "I have the recording," Crix said, and she played the footage the assembly watched as a young Admiral Yoon Seojin stood where Park Ga had stood 3 months ago, and his voice carried urgency and fear. "The Hollow are testing our defenses." The recording showed him saying, "We cannot hold them alone forever, and we need the Council to help us develop better weapons and train more crews." Councillor Varath's younger self appeared on the screen, and his mocking laughter cut through the recording. "Perhaps the humans see monsters because they are monsters themselves," the past Varath said. "Perhaps they want our resources for their own expansion." The recording ended, and the present Varath looked at the floor as if he wished it would swallow him. "We did this," he whispered, and his voice cracked with grief. "We drove them away, and now our people are dying because of our pride." Morvan made his decision and rose to his full height. "I will broadcast a message to Earth," he declared. "A formal apology from the Galactic Council and a plea for assistance. They will not answer. a delegate said. They have ignored every communication we have sent. Then I will make them listen, Morvan replied. And there was steel beneath his exhaustion. He stood before the broadcast array and spoke words that no High Arbiter had ever spoken before. People of Earth, he began. And his voice carried across the stars. I speak to you not as a leader, but as a fool who has finally seen his mistakes. He paused and gathered his courage. We wronged you in every way possible. And we dismissed your warnings and mocked your sacrifices. And we told ourselves that you were the threat when you were the only thing protecting us. Tears fell from his ancient eyes. I cannot undo what we have done. And I cannot bring back the humans who died defending a galaxy that hated them. But I can tell you that we were wrong. He lowered his head. Please help us. Not because we deserve it, but because you are better than we ever believed you could be. The message traveled through space and reached the border where human ships held their silent vigil. Captain Kang Da-yoon received it on the bridge of the Vigilant and forwarded it immediately to Fleet. Command Admiral Yoon Seo-jin sat in his quarters aboard the flagship and watched the High Arbiter's words play. Across his screen his face showed nothing, but his hands gripped the arms of his chair until his knuckles turned white. He remembered every battle, every funeral, every comrade lost to the Hollow while the Council debated whether humans should be allowed to colonize more worlds. He remembered the insults and the restrictions and the votes that treated his people like dangerous animals. His first officer stood in the doorway and watched him. Carefully, Admiral, she said softly. The fleet is waiting for orders. Yoon said nothing for a long moment. Tell them to stand by, he finally replied. And his voice was thick with emotions he could not name. The officer nodded and left. And Yoon turned back to the screen where Morvan's message still played somewhere out there. Billions of innocent beings were about to face an enemy they could not fight. And their only crime was trusting leaders who had been too arrogant to see the truth. Yoon thought of his grandchildren on Earth, safe behind the new perimeter the human ships now guarded. Thought of the children on alien worlds who had never voted against humanity, who had never laughed at human warnings, who were simply afraid and alone in the dark. He made his decision and opened a channel to Earth. It was time to go home and have a very difficult conversation. The return the Earth Assembly Chamber was filled with angry voices that crashed against each other like waves in a storm. Representatives from every human colony had gathered to debate the question that Admiral Yoon Seo-jin had brought before them, and opinions were divided sharply. They laughed while our soldiers died. A delegate from Mars shouted, They called us monsters while we bled to protect them. My grandfather gave his life on Perimeter Station 7, another representative added. And the council voted to restrict human military operations the same year he fell in battle. The crowd roared with agreement, and the sound shook the ancient walls. Admiral Yoon sat in the observer's gallery and watched the debate unfold with tired eyes. He understood their anger because he shared it, and he had spent sleepless nights wrestling with the same fury that now filled this chamber. Ambassador Park Ji-ae rose from her seat, and the chamber slowly fell quiet. She had become something of a legend since her farewell speech, and even those who disagreed with her listened when she spoke. Everything you say is true, she began, and her voice was calm and steady. We were wronged in ways that words cannot capture, and our dead deserve better than to be forgotten by those they protected. She paused and looked around the chamber. But I did not come here to talk about the dead, and I came here to talk about the living. She activated a holographic display that showed images of alien worlds under siege. These are the systems that the Hollow have already consumed, she said. And these are the refugees who are fleeing toward the core. The images showed ships packed with terrified families, children clinging to their parents, elders too weak to run. They did not vote against us, Park Ji-ae continued. They did not laugh at our warnings, and they did not know that humans were fighting and dying on their behalf. She turned to face the angriest voices in the crowd. When we walk away from someone who is suffering, we do not punish the leaders who wronged us, and instead we become the monsters they always believed we were. The chamber erupted again. But this time, the voices were more uncertain. Admiral Yoon stood and walked to the speaking platform, and his presence silenced the room. "I have fought the Hollow for 40 years, he said, and his voice carried the weight of 1,000 battles. "And I have buried more friends than I can count." He met the eyes of the delegates one by one. "I have every reason to hate the council, and some nights I do." He straightened his shoulders. "But hate is not who we are, and it has never been who we are. And I will not let the council's failures turn us into something less than human." The vote was called, and the decision was made by a margin of only 17 votes. Humanity would return 3 days later. The combined human fleet emerged from hyperspace at the council's last defensive line, and the surviving alien ships nearly opened fire before they recognized the familiar silhouettes. Captain Kang Do-yoon led the vanguard in his small but legendary vessel, and behind him came warships that had never been seen by alien eyes. These were the Perimeter Fleet, the Shadow Navy that had fought the secret war for 200 years, and they carried weapons that no other species possessed. "This is Admiral Yoon Se-jin to all council forces," the human commander announced. "Fall back and protect the evacuation transports, and leave the Hollow to us." The alien ships were treated with desperate gratitude, and the human fleet advanced into the darkness. What followed was a battle that would be remembered for 1,000 generations. The Hollow came in waves of impossible darkness, and the human ships met them with weapons that burned with frequencies designed to tear dimensional barriers apart. Captain Kang led strike teams into the heart of the enemy formation, and his crew fought with the cold precision of warriors who knew exactly what they were facing. Explosions of strange light filled the void as hollow entities were destroyed for the first time in millennia. And slowly the tide began to turn. Admiral Yoon commanded from his flagship and directed the battle with tactical genius born from decades of experience. "Seal the rifts," he ordered. "Use the dimensional charges and close every breach before more can come through." Human engineers deployed devices that pulsed with energy no alien species understood. And one by one, the doorways between dimensions slammed shut. The remaining hollow screamed in frequencies that shattered windows across the nearby stations. And then they were gone. The darkness retreated, and the stars returned to their proper brightness in the aftermath. High Arbiter Morvan's shuttle docked with Admiral Yoon's flagship, and the ancient leader walked the corridors of a human vessel for the first time. He found the Admiral standing alone in an observation deck, watching the rescued ships carry survivors to safety. "Admiral Yoon," Morvan said, and his voice trembled. "I do not have words sufficient to express what I feel. Yoon did not turn around. We did not return for you," he said. And there was no anger in his voice, only exhaustion. "We returned because someone had to, and we were the only ones who could." Morvan lowered his head. "I know we do not deserve forgiveness." "No," Yoon agreed. "You do not." He finally turned to face the High Arbiter. "But forgiveness is not about deserving. And neither is mercy. And neither is choosing to protect those who cannot protect themselves." Below them, human medics moved among the alien wounded, treating injuries without asking which species had voted against them, which representatives had laughed at their warnings. Ambassador Park Ji-ae watched from another ship and allowed herself. A small smile. Counselor Varath stood nearby, and his eyes followed the human rescue teams with something that looked like wonder. "I do not understand," he said quietly. "We treated you terribly, and you came back anyway." Park Ji-ae looked at him and saw not the arrogant politician who had mocked her, but a broken being who was only now learning how wrong he had been. "This is who we are," she said. And her voice was gentle, despite everything. It always was. She turned back to the viewport where stars were shining bright again. You simply never looked.